My name is Commander Aldous Ferris Kane, and I am giving this deposition on the 14th of March 1963 to the Royal Navy Historical Records Tribunal, convened at Portsmouth, in relation to the survey voyage of HMS Perseverant during the Southern Hemisphere summer of 1932, and specifically in relation to the damage report filed upon our return to Simonstown on the 4th of February of that year. I am 61 years old. I was 30 years old when the events I am about to describe took place. I held the rank of Lieutenant Commander at the time, assigned to the Hydrographic Office under Rear Admiral Story, and my professional background was in marine cartography and nautical survey. I am not a man given to exaggeration. I spent the subsequent 30 years of my career in precisely the kind of work that demands exactness, and I have filed hundreds of survey reports in that time. Every one of them is accurate. Every one of them describes what was actually there. This will be the first time I have described, on record, what was actually there in the winter of 1932. I am compelled to contradict the official account now because I understand that the Hydrographic Office intends to declassify and publish the Perseverant voyage survey logs as part of a broader historical archive project, and the damage report contained in those logs is a fabrication that I helped to write. I wrote it with the full knowledge of what I was doing. I signed it. I will not allow it to stand unchallenged as a historical record without entering the truth alongside it. And this tribunal, whatever it decides to do with my testimony, will at minimum have the accurate account in its possession. I will be as precise as I am capable of being. The chart is Exhibit A before this tribunal. It is the hand-drawn Admiralty chart recovered from the sealed dispatch case of the Portuguese carrack Santa Perpetua, which was raised from shallow water off the Biscay coast in the spring of 1931 by a Franco-British salvage concern. The dispatch case had been sealed with wax, and then packed in oiled sailcloth, and then sealed again with pine tar, which is almost certainly why it survived 3 centuries and some years underwater in better condition than any other document in the case. The chart itself is a pilot chart of the southern Atlantic and a portion of the southern Indian Ocean, produced sometime in the late 16th century, possibly the 1580s, based on the cartographic conventions used in the representation of the African coastline. The paper is Portuguese rag, the ink is iron gall, and the draftsmanship is competent, but not exceptional. It is the work of a ship's navigator, or perhaps a trained pilot, not a professional cartographer. What is exceptional is the marginalia. There are 2 sets of annotations on the chart, and they are written in 2 different hands. I established this in the first hour of examining the chart, and it was confirmed subsequently by the Document Analysis Office. The first hand is the same as the hand that drew the chart itself. This person wrote, in Portuguese, along the left margin at approximately 42 degrees south latitude, a line that translates roughly as, "At this crossing, the reef that breathes, 7 leagues west of the marked current, avoid in all weather, the cold comes before it rises." The handwriting is careful and deliberate, as if the writer wanted to be sure it was legible. It is not the kind of marginal notation you make in haste. It is the kind of notation you make because you need the man who reads this chart after you to understand exactly what you are telling him. The second hand is different, looser. The ink is a slightly different shade, which suggests a different age of application, though whether that means weeks or years or decades later is impossible to determine with certainty. This person wrote in the same margin, in Portuguese that is more archaic in construction than the first, a single line. It turned toward us, and we saw its length. God preserve us. It was as long as this ship and more. It turned and went down, and the cold went with it. Then below that, in what appears to be the same second hand, but written more quickly, and pressed harder into the paper, "Do not stop here. Do not sound here. Do not lower anything into the water here." I want to be precise about what I felt when I read those lines for the first time in the Cartographic Review Room in London in the late summer of 1931. I felt nothing, initially. beyond mild professional interest. The history of nautical charts is full of marginal annotations, recording hazards, superstitions, local warnings, and outright fiction. The sea monsters that appear as illustrations on historical charts were artistic conventions as often as they were genuine reports, and even when a navigator recorded something he genuinely believed, that record required interpretation. Sailors have mistaken manatees for mermaids and whale spouts for sea serpents and floating mats of seaweed for islands. A Portuguese crew in the 16th century, encountering anything large and unusual in the Southern Ocean, would have had a limited framework for understanding what they were seeing. I did not immediately take the annotations seriously. What I did take seriously was my professional obligation to the archive. My assignment from the Hydrographic Office was to cross-reference the Santa Perpetua chart against existing British and Dutch Admiralty holdings from the same period and region, specifically to determine whether any features depicted on the chart corresponded to uncharted hazards that might be relevant to contemporary navigational safety. This was standard review procedure for recovered historical charts. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work a junior officer with a specialty in historical cartography was given when there was nothing more urgent to do. I began the cross-reference systematically. I worked from north to south along the chart, checking each depicted feature and notation against the corresponding area in the British holdings and the Dutch charts that the Hydrographic Office held under exchange agreements. Most of the cross-referencing produced nothing of note. The chart depicted the African coastline with reasonable accuracy, given its age, and the hazard annotations in the approaches to the Cape of Good Hope corresponded generally to known features, even if the 16th century representation of those features was imprecise by modern standards. I reached the southern portion of the chart, below the Cape, sometime in the second week of September 1931. The notation about the breathing reef sat at approximately 42 degrees south latitude, and a longitude that, when I converted the historical reckoning to modern coordinates, placed it approximately 380 nautical miles southwest of Cape Point, well into open ocean. I logged it in my cross-reference notes as historical hazard notation, possibly referring to a deep-water upwelling, low-tide seamount, or biological surface phenomenon. Annotators report sensation of cold water preceding the hazard. No corresponding feature in British holdings for this position. No corresponding feature. That should have been the end of it. I will come back to what I found the following week, when I had cause to pull the Dutch and Spanish holdings for the same region. Before I get to that, I need to describe the physical state of the chart more precisely, because the tribunal should understand what I was working with and why certain details registered the way they did. The chart was approximately 2 feet by 3 feet when unfolded. The paper had suffered some water damage at the edges, but the central portion, including the annotated region, was in remarkably good condition. When I worked with it, I wore cotton examination gloves and examined it under a strong lamp because the archival light in the review room was not sufficient for detailed work. The feel of the chart under my gloved hands was peculiar in the way that very old paper is peculiar, dense and slightly brittle, with a rigidity to it that modern paper does not have, as if the material had been compressed by its centuries of storage. The ink of the marginalia was darker than I expected, given the age, and stood out clearly against the yellowed paper. What I noticed when I held the chart under the strong lamp and examined the margin closely was that the annotation was not written in a single session. I could see where the nib had been reloaded in the middle of certain words. The writer had paused. Whether that was because they were being careful, or because they were writing in difficult conditions, I cannot say. But there is a quality to deliberate handwriting, a slight heaviness at the beginning of each stroke, where the writer is pressing intentionally, that tells you the person was thinking about what they wrote. This was not a scribble. This was a considered record. That detail stayed with me. The following week I pulled the Dutch holdings. The Hydrographic Office maintained an extensive archive of Dutch East India Company charts, acquired through various means over the preceding century and a half, and I had access to the relevant portions for the Southern Atlantic and Indian Ocean approaches. I cross-referenced systematically, as I had with the Portuguese chart, and I reached the corresponding latitude sometime on a Thursday morning, I believe the 17th of September. The first Dutch chart to show the region was a VOC pilot chart, dated approximately 1623. It depicted the same area of open ocean below the Cape. It showed no feature at the coordinate I was examining. But in the margin, in Dutch, a navigator had written, "At this place the ship went cold without reason, and a shadow passed under the hull. We increased sail and did not stop." Below that, in what appeared to be a different hand, possibly added later, the pilot says a whale, but I have seen whales. This was not a whale. It did not surface, only the cold and the shadow. I stopped working for approximately 5 minutes. I sat in the review room and I looked at the Dutch chart annotation. Then I looked at my cross-reference notes from the Portuguese chart. Then I sat with both sets of notes on the desk in front of me, and I thought about coincidence. 40 years separate those two charts at minimum. Different languages, different navigators, different ships, the same latitude. The same phenomenon, cold water arriving without apparent cause, followed by something large and dark below or at the surface, followed by a deliberate decision to increase speed and leave the area without stopping. The Portuguese annotators had seen its surface. The Dutch annotator had seen its shadow. But both placed the event at a coordinate that, when I worked out the reckoning, was within perhaps 15 to 20 nautical miles of the position annotated on the Portuguese chart. Given the navigational precision available to those crews, that was essentially the same location. I will not say that I knew then what I would eventually know. What I will say is that I stopped treating this as a routine archive cross-reference and began treating it as something that required careful, methodical investigation. I spent the next 3 weeks pulling every chart in the British and Dutch holdings that covered the region below the Cape of Good Hope, between 35 and 50 degrees south latitude. I also requested access to the Spanish colonial chart holdings that the office held through a separate exchange agreement with the Madrid Hydrographic Service. I told my supervising officer, a Captain Morrow, that I was conducting a complete legacy hazard survey for the region in connection with the Santa Perpetua chart review. He approved the expanded scope without asking many questions. I was known as a thorough worker, and the expanded scope was not, on its face, unusual. What I found over those 3 weeks is the foundation of this deposition. I identified, in total, 5 independent chart annotations describing phenomena at or within 20 nautical miles of the same coordinate, spanning from approximately 1580 to 1771. 2 Portuguese, 1 Dutch, and 2 Spanish. Each annotation was in a different hand. Each used different language and different terms of reference. The phenomena they described were not identical in every detail, as you would expect from independent eyewitness accounts of any event, but they shared a consistent core of observable facts that I will summarize here. First, the water in the area became unexpectedly cold, and the cold was described by 3 of the 5 annotators as sudden and localized, meaning that it did not correspond to a general sea temperature change, but arrived as if the cold were emanating from a specific point, or from below. One Spanish annotator described it as putting a hand into a winter river while standing in summer air. Second, something was observed in the water that all 5 annotators described as very large. The Portuguese first-hand annotator wrote that it was as long as the ship. The Dutch annotator described a shadow broader than the ship's beam. A Spanish annotator from approximately 1690 wrote the most detailed description. He described the animal surfacing partially, with a fin rising from the water that he estimated at the height of 2 men standing, and described the animal's back as dark gray and massive, and wrote that it lay at the surface for some time, parallel to the hull, before descending. Third, none of the 5 annotated encounters described an attack. 3 annotators explicitly stated that the animal did not approach or strike the vessel. 2 did not comment on this directly, but the fact that the ship survived to produce the annotated charts suggests the same outcome. Fourth, every annotation included some form of instruction to avoid the area, expressed with varying degrees of urgency. The most urgent was the Portuguese second hands, "Do not stop here, do not sound here, do not lower anything into the water here." The least urgent was a Dutch notation that simply added an asterisk at the coordinate and wrote, "Here a hazard of unknown type, see master's log," which I could not access because the master's log had not survived. I compiled all of this into a memorandum for Captain Morrow. I did not, in that memorandum, speculate explicitly about the nature of the phenomenon or the animal. I presented the evidence as a pattern of historical hazard annotations at a specific coordinate, recommended that the coordinate be added to the Southern Ocean Hazard Register as an area of unconfirmed navigational risk, and suggested that a survey vessel be dispatched to conduct a physical inspection of the area in order to either identify or rule out a geological or biological source for the reported phenomena. I knew what I was doing. I was proposing a voyage to a specific location in the Southern Ocean in terms that an institution would approve, because I understood that if I wrote what I actually thought the 5 annotations were describing, Captain Morrow would refer me to the medical officer rather than the survey board. What I thought the 5 annotations were describing was this: an animal of exceptional size, possibly a species unknown to contemporary science, that had been present at or near a specific location in the Southern Ocean at least 5 times across approximately 2 centuries, and that continued, for all I knew, to be present there. Captain Morrow read my memorandum and asked me 2 questions. He asked whether I thought the area posed a genuine navigational hazard to modern shipping, and I said I believed it warranted investigation. He asked whether the historical account was reliable enough to justify the cost of a survey voyage, and I said the pattern of independent corroboration was, in my professional judgment, sufficient to meet the standard for investigation of a potential uncharted hazard. He approved the voyage the following week, under a geological survey mandate, as the office had found it easier to secure funding for geological work than for biological investigation in that period. I was assigned as commanding officer of the survey vessel HMS Perseverant, a 180-foot steam-powered hydrographic survey ship, and given a crew of 23, including 3 additional survey specialists. I will come to those 3 individuals in a moment because they matter to what followed. We departed Simonstown on the 8th of January, 1932, and reached the general area of the coordinate on the 16th of January after uneventful passage. The Southern Hemisphere summer meant long days and moderate weather, and the approach to the survey area was straightforward. The sea was blue and calm, the air warm, and the conditions were, by any ordinary measure, ideal for survey work. I had not told the crew why we were specifically interested in that coordinate. The cover story was geological. We were conducting a seabed profile survey of a region where historical charts suggested the possibility of an uncharted seamount that might represent a navigational hazard. Several of the crew had done this kind of work before and did not find the objective unusual. The 3 survey specialists assigned to the voyage were Dr. Emmeline Prosser, a marine geologist from the Imperial College who had conducted several deep-water survey expeditions in the North Atlantic and was technically proficient and entirely self-possessed. She was 34 years old and had dealt with enough naval bureaucracy to know how to work inside a system without fighting it, and she was the person on board I trusted most completely. She would prove, before the voyage was over, to have better judgment than anyone else on the ship, including me. The second specialist was Mr. Roland Ashby, a photographer and equipment operator contracted by the Hydrographic Office to manage the camera rig and the sounding equipment. He was 27, enthusiastic to the point of recklessness, and in possession of a camera rig that he talked about as though it were a member of his family. He wanted, more than anything else on that voyage, to use it. I will come to what that wanting cost him. The third was Lieutenant James Carrick, my first mate, who was not a specialist, but who I am listing here because he matters as much as any of the specialists. He was 35, an experienced sea officer who had served with me on a previous survey voyage in the North Sea, and who was not a man who frightened easily. He was also not a man who pretended to be something he wasn't. When Carrick was afraid, he said he was afraid. He did not dress it up or dress it down. I want the tribunal to remember that when I come to what he said to me on the night of the 17th of January. We reached the coordinate at approximately 1400 hours on the 16th of January. I had the ship heave to and I walked the deck and checked the sea conditions. The water was dark blue and clear, with a moderate swell from the northwest. The air temperature was approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which was consistent with a southern hemisphere summer at that latitude. There was nothing unusual that I could observe. The ship's thermometer read the surface water temperature at 61 degrees, which was within expected range for that latitude in summer. I ordered the first sounding at 14:30 hours. The depth came back at approximately 2,400 fathoms, which was consistent with open abyssal ocean and did not suggest any seamount in the immediate vicinity. We conducted 4 soundings over the following 2 hours, moving in a systematic grid, and all returns were consistent. There was no geological feature of note at or near the coordinate. I want to be honest about what I felt at that point. A precise, clinical kind of disappointment. 5 centuries of independent corroboration had led me to a patch of open ocean that was, by every measurement I had available, unremarkable. I began to consider the possibility that I had made an error in the coordinate calculation, or that I had overestimated the navigational precision of the historical charts, or that whatever phenomenon those 5 sets of annotators had recorded was geological in nature and had since resolved itself, a volcanic feature perhaps that had subsided in the centuries between their observations and mine. I ordered supper and told Carrick to maintain position overnight and repeat the sounding grid in the morning. I went below to my chart room and spent 2 hours re-examining my coordinate calculations and finding nothing wrong with them. Then, at approximately 2100 hours, the cold arrived. I was at my chart table when it happened. I felt it through the hull before anything else registered. There was no dramatic announcement. What happened was this. The chart room, which had been at a reasonable working temperature for a subtropical summer evening, became abruptly and noticeably colder. Not gradually, the way a room cools when someone opens a door to cold air, but all at once, as if the warmth had been drawn out of it rather than displaced. The feeling was physical and immediate. I was wearing my working uniform, no jacket, and the chill went straight through the cloth and registered on my skin as something sharp and wrong. I had been comfortable 30 seconds before. I was not comfortable now. I sat still for a moment and listened. The ship creaked around me in the ordinary way of ships at anchor. There was no obvious explanation for the temperature change. I picked up my jacket, put it on, and went up to the bridge. Carrick was on watch. He turned when I came in, and I could see immediately that he was aware of something. His face had the particular stillness that it acquired when he was paying close attention. "You felt it," he said. I asked him what the thermometer read. He had already checked. The bridge thermometer, which monitored air temperature inside the wheelhouse, had dropped 11 degrees in less than 4 minutes. He had timed it. Outside, leaning over the bridge rail to check the deck thermometer, he said it was even colder, and the sea surface thermometer had dropped from 61 degrees to what he estimated at 44 or lower. He wasn't sure the instrument was reading accurately at that range because it had not been calibrated for those temperatures in a summer deployment. I went outside onto the bridge wing. The contrast was immediate and physical. Stepping through the door was like stepping into November in Portsmouth, except that the sky above us was clear and starred, and there was no wind to account for it. The air was cold enough that my breath was visible. In January, in the southern Atlantic, at that latitude. In summer, my breath was fogging in front of my face. I gripped the rail and stood there for approximately 30 seconds, feeling the cold against my hands through the metal. The rail was markedly colder than it should have been. cold enough that holding it for more than a few seconds was uncomfortable. The deck under my feet had a chill that came up through the soles of my shoes, as if the planking were drawing warmth out of me and sending it somewhere below. I looked at the water. The sea was flat. That was the other thing. The moderate northwest swell that had been running all afternoon had leveled to near glassy calm, and the surface of the water in the darkness around the ship had a quality to it that I am going to describe as density rather than any more specific term, because I am not sure a more specific term exists for what I mean. It looked heavy, as if something was pressing the water flat from below. I went back inside and told Carrick to wake Dr. Prosser and Ashby, and to have the deck watch doubled. Then I went back to my chart room, and I took out the Portuguese chart, in its archival folder, and I read the margin annotation again. The cold comes before it rises. I have given 31 years of service to an institution that values measured, verifiable claims. I am not a man who reaches for dramatic conclusions. But I sat in that chart room in an inexplicable chill, reading a 350-year-old annotation that described exactly what was happening to my ship, and I will tell this tribunal that I knew. Not guessed, not feared, not imagined, knew. Whatever had motivated 6 separate crews over 2 centuries to annotate that coordinate with warnings in the margins of their charts was present in the water beneath my ship at that moment. I knew it the way you know things, through your skin, before your mind has caught up. Dr. Prosser arrived on the bridge in under 3 minutes, which told me she had not been sleeping. She walked straight to the external thermometer and examined it, then came inside and asked for the log of readings from the past half hour, which Carrick produced. She read through it without speaking. Then she asked whether we had a reading from the current instrument, because the gauge appeared to be at the lower end of its calibrated range. Carrick said the reading appeared to be approximately 43 degrees. She nodded once and said that in open subtropical water in summer, that reading was not consistent with any natural upwelling, current intersection, or known oceanographic phenomenon she was aware of. She did not seem frightened. She seemed interested in the way that a rigorous professional becomes interested when the data stops making sense in an ordinary way and starts demanding a new explanation. I respected her for that. Ashby arrived 2 minutes after her, and he went immediately for his equipment locker. I told him to hold. He looked at me with the expression of a man being told to hold the most important thing he had ever been asked to do, which was accurate. I told him that we did not know yet what we were dealing with, and that I wanted the deck cleared and secure before anyone moved equipment to an exposed position. He argued. Carrick put a hand on his arm, and Ashby subsided, but he was vibrating with the effort of it. We stood on the bridge for what I believe was approximately an hour and a half. The temperature held at its reduced level, steady and wrong. The deck watch reported nothing visible in the water around the ship. We sounded the hull with a mallet, a simple but useful procedure for detecting whether something was in contact with the keel, and heard nothing unusual. The ship rode normally in the flat water. Then, at approximately 2,025-250 hours, the hull registered its first pressure event. I will describe this carefully because it is the detail that the damage report attributed to an uncharted igneous shelf, and the tribunal should understand what actually happened. A pressure event against a ship's hull is felt as a wave of compression that travels through the structure of the vessel. The nearest everyday comparison would be the feeling of a bow wave striking the side of a ship at rest, but that comparison is inadequate because a bow wave arrives from a direction and has a shape that the hull recognizes. What we felt that night had no direction. It came from below, broadly and evenly, as if something of enormous horizontal extent had passed close beneath the keel, and the water displaced by that passage had pressed upward against the hull, simultaneously along a significant portion of its length. The Perseverant was 180 feet overall. The pressure I felt through my feet standing on the bridge deck registered along the full length of the ship. Every man on board who was awake felt it. The pressure event lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was not violent, it was massive. There is a difference. And I want the tribunal to understand the distinction. A violent event has impact, percussive force, sharp edges. What we felt was none of those things. It was the pressure of immense mass moving slowly through water very close beneath us. And the feeling of it communicated something that I am going to describe as scale, because I can find no more precise word. The body understood, from the quality of that pressure, that what had passed beneath the keel was very large indeed. After it passed, there was a moment of total silence on the bridge. Then Carrick said, quietly and without dramatics, that was not a rock. He was the first to say it. He was right. I ordered a sounding immediately. The depth came back at 2,390 fathoms. The seabed had not changed. Whatever had produced that pressure event had not been the seabed. It had been something in the water column, somewhere between the hull and the abyss below it, moving in a direction that, if I had to guess from the quality of the displacement, was roughly north to south, parallel to our position. I looked at Carrick. He looked at me. Dr. Prosser was writing in her field notebook, fast and steady. Ashby was gripping his equipment locker key with both hands. Nothing further happened that night. By 0300 hours, the temperature had begun to recover. By 0430, it was within 3 degrees of its previous value. The sea resumed a gentle swell. The deck watch saw nothing. We stood down the doubled watch at 0500, and I ordered hot food and told the crew we had recorded an interesting oceanographic anomaly and would continue survey work in the morning. I did not sleep. I spent the pre-dawn hours at my chart table, writing up the evening's events in precise detail in my survey log and reading the margin annotations on the Portuguese chart one more time. I also read, for perhaps the 6th time in the previous 3 weeks, the 1690 Spanish annotation, the most detailed of the 5 I had found. The Spanish navigator had written that the animal lay at the surface for some time, parallel to the hull, the same ship it had passed beneath. In the morning I gathered Carrick, Dr. Prosser, and Ashby in my day cabin and told them what I had found in the historical charts. I brought the Portuguese chart in its archival folder, and I laid it on the table, and I read them the marginalia. Then I told them about the other 4 annotations, and summarized what each said. I told them the coordinate we were sitting at. I told them that the pressure event of the previous night, combined with the temperature drop and the pattern of historical observation, suggested to me that we were dealing with a living organism of exceptional size. I expected argument. What I got was silence, which was more informative. Ashby was the first to speak. He said the camera rig could be lowered to 200 feet on its cable in under 20 minutes, that he had high-speed film loaded, and that if the animal came to the surface in daylight, the lens he had mounted would capture detail at up to 60 yards. He said this the way a carpenter tells you the exact specification of a nail. He was already past the question of what it was, and into the question of how to document it. Carrick said he thought we should steam north immediately and report by wireless that the survey had encountered unusual oceanographic conditions and required further equipment. He was not panicking. He was calculating risks with the accuracy he always brought to his work. He said the historical accounts all showed the same outcome. The animal had not attacked any of the vessels that held position near it. But he did not think that consistency was a guarantee, and he thought the prudent course was to leave while we had the chance to do so safely. Dr. Prosser said nothing for a long moment. Then she said she wanted to see the full set of historical annotations before she gave an opinion. I gave them to her, and she read through my compiled notes while the 3 of us sat around the table and did not speak. It took her perhaps 12 minutes. When she finished, she set the notes down carefully and said, "If this is what you think it is, then the question of whether to document it or leave is not primarily a scientific question. It is an ethical one, and we are not equipped to answer it responsibly in 20 minutes, in a cabin in the Southern Ocean." That was the clearest thing anyone said that day. It was also the thing I understood least, in the moment, and have thought about most in the 30 years since. I decided we would maintain position for a second day. I gave Ashby permission to prepare his equipment, but not to deploy it until I gave an explicit order. I told Carrick that if at any point in the coming 24 hours he believed the vessel was in danger, he had authority to call for immediate departure, and I would not countermand it. He acknowledged that without comment. We spent the morning of January 17th conducting routine sounding work and speaking very little. The sea was brilliant and blue, and the temperature was normal, and there was absolutely nothing unusual observable in any direction. A man looking at the ship from the outside that morning would have seen a competent survey crew doing competent work in benign conditions. Inside the ship, every man who had been on the bridge the previous night was thinking about what had passed beneath the keel in the dark, and trying to reconcile it with the flat, peaceful ocean around them. I kept the Portuguese chart on my chart table. I found myself checking it periodically, as if it might have changed. The cold came again at 16:14 hours. This time I was on deck, and I felt it through the soles of my shoes first, the planking suddenly colder beneath my feet, with a speed that had no meteorological explanation, and then against my face and forearms, as the air temperature dropped with a sharpness that was almost tactile, like pressing your hand against a block of ice. I pulled up the collar of my jacket and signaled to the deck watch and called to the bridge. The surface thermometer registered 39 degrees within 6 minutes. In subtropical summer air, with clear skies, the deck thermometer read 48 degrees. The caulking along the waterline, I was told by the boatswain afterward, had begun to compress along a stretch of about 30 feet amidships, where the cold was apparently most intense against the hull. One short section near frame 42 actually cracked, the compound opening a hairline gap that the boatswain subsequently repaired, and that was later cited in the damage report as evidence of thermal stress consistent with contact with a cold geological formation. It was not a geological formation. It was the cold the Portuguese annotator had written about in the margin of his chart, translated across 3.5 centuries, pressing against my ship's hull with enough force to crack the cork. I want the tribunal to feel what that detail means. Not see it, not analyze it. Feel it. The cold was specific enough, concentrated enough, localized enough against the hull of a 180-foot steel-reinforced wooden survey ship that it cracked the waterproof caulking compound along 30 feet of the waterline. This was not a general sea temperature drop. This was cold, emanating from a source that was close to the hull, below the waterline, and of sufficient thermal mass to affect the hull material itself. The boatswain estimated it would have required a water temperature of approximately 35 degrees or lower in direct contact with the hull to produce that effect. The ambient sea temperature before the event had been 61 degrees. That is a differential of 26 degrees at the point of hull contact. I do not know the physiological mechanism by which an animal, however large, could produce that kind of localized thermal effect in open ocean. I have read, in subsequent years, literature on deep-water marine animals and their relationship to thermoclines, and I have seen suggestions that very large animals, ascending rapidly from great depth, could bring cold deep water with them in a kind of thermal wake. Whether that is sufficient to explain what I measured that afternoon, I genuinely do not know. What I know is what the instruments read, what the boatswain found on the waterline, and what the Portuguese navigator wrote in the margin of his chart before I was born. At approximately 16:41 hours, the pressure event came again. This time it was more pronounced than the previous night. More pronounced not in the sense of more violent, I want to be precise about that distinction, but in the sense of closer. The previous night's event had felt like something large passing beneath us at some distance below the keel. This event felt as though whatever was producing it was directly below us, much closer to the surface. The pressure moved through the hull with a quality that I can only describe as intimate, in the sense that it was specific and local and detailed in a way that the previous event had not been. I could feel it travel from bow to stern across a period of perhaps 6 seconds. 6 seconds to travel 180 feet. That is either very slow or something of very great length. Carrick gripped the bridge rail and looked at the sea around us. "Hold on," he said, to no one in particular. We were already holding on. And then, at 16:47 hours on the 17th of January, 1932, approximately 40 yards off the port quarter, the water broke. It did not erupt. It did not explode upward in a dramatic geyser. What happened was a slow, massive displacement of the surface, the kind of displacement you see when something very heavy rises through water at low speed, where the surface tension resists and then gives all at once. The water rose in a smooth dome to port, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, and then the dome broke, and a form began to emerge from it with the unhurried deliberateness of something that had done this, or something very like this, many thousands of times. The dorsal fin came first. I have stated in my survey notes, and I will restate here for the tribunal, that I subsequently measured the height of the Perseverance port rail from the waterline at 4 feet and 2 inches. I was standing at that rail looking at the dorsal fin, and the fin cleared the waterline to a height that I estimated at the time, and have retained in my memory without material change across 31 years, at no less than 11 feet above the surface, likely 12. It was dark gray, with a slight trailing curve at the upper tip, and it was moving slowly, north to south, parallel to the hull. It was moving at perhaps 2 knots, maybe less. Then the back began to emerge. I want to be careful here because what I describe will sound like the kind of thing a person says when they have exaggerated a story across decades of retelling. I am aware of that risk. I have tried to examine my memory of this moment with the same methodical skepticism I would apply to any evidence, and what I am about to say is what I observed, not what I wished I had observed, not what I reconstructed afterward, not what someone else told me I had seen. I was standing at the port rail of HMS Perseverant, at a distance of roughly 40 yards from the animal, in full daylight, in clear conditions, and I watched its surface. The back that emerged was dark gray, almost charcoal, and it was broad. Not whale broad, which has a familiar, rounded quality that any sailor in those waters would recognize. This was flat and massive, in the way that a stone shelf is flat and massive, with a solidity to it that seemed wrong for something alive in the same way that seeing a moving wall is wrong. The head was below the surface, or at least the break of the head was not above it, and the tail section was also not visible, which meant that what I was seeing was the mid-portion of the animal's dorsal surface, exposed at the waterline. It extended, in parallel with my ship's hull, for approximately the same distance that the hull itself extended. I paced the Perseverance deck from stem to stern on the 16th for a navigation reference, and it measured 181 feet from the tip of the bowsprit to the taffrail. The animal's exposed midsection was approximately 150 to 160 feet in length. That is what I saw. I am not going to soften that figure. I wrote it in my survey log on the night of the 17th of January, 1932, before the log was confiscated by naval authority. I am repeating it here under oath. 150 to 160 feet of dorsal surface, exposed at the waterline, moving at approximately 2 knots parallel to my hull, at 40 yards distance, in full afternoon sunlight. Ashby was at the port rail beside me within 30 seconds of the surfacing. He had his camera. I had not given him the order to deploy the rig, and I did not give him the order then, but he had a hand camera that he carried habitually, and he was using it. I heard the shutter. I heard it more than once. I do not know what happened to those photographs, because the entire contents of Ashby's professional equipment were included in the material surrendered to naval records at the end of the voyage, and I have never seen or heard of those images since. Carrick was on the bridge. I could hear him speaking to the helm, but I could not make out the words from my position at the rail. I later learned that he had ordered the engine room to prepare for full steam ahead, a precautionary measure that I would not have countermanded. He was also, I learned later, watching the animal through the bridge binoculars and recording what he observed in the watch log, which was thorough and correct of him. Dr. Prosser was standing 3 feet to my right at the rail, and she had her field notebook open and was writing. I glanced at her once during those 22 minutes, and she was writing continuously, her pen moving steadily across the page, her eyes going from the animal to the notebook and back. She was not visibly shaken. Her hand was steady. She was doing what she had been trained to do, which was to observe and record, and she was doing it well. The 22 minutes felt much longer than 22 minutes. I will not pretend otherwise. But I will say that the primary quality of those 22 minutes was not terror, though there was that. The primary quality was attention. We were all paying an absolute quality of attention to what was in front of us, the kind of attention that exists when the usual internal running commentary of the mind goes entirely quiet because the thing you are observing has demanded all of your capacity for perception. The animal moved parallel to the hull for the full duration. It did not turn toward the ship. It did not alter its course. It did not increase its speed. It simply surfaced, maintained its parallel course at that speed, and was present alongside us for 22 minutes with the unhurried, unconcerned authority of something that occupied a different relationship to urgency than anything I had ever encountered. It was not performing. It was not threatening. It was not fleeing. It was simply there, in the water beside us, and we were there in the water beside it, and for 22 minutes, those two facts existed simultaneously in the Southern Ocean, 40 yards apart. At some point in the 14th or 15th minute, I became aware that I had not been breathing normally. I forced myself to take a controlled breath and consciously regulate my respiration, and the act of doing that clarified something. The animal was not interested in us as prey or as threat. Whatever it was doing at the surface, and I will come to my interpretation of that, it was not preparing to attack. The historical annotations had all said the same thing. It surfaced. It lay beside the ship. It went down. 5 separate accounts spanning 2 centuries, all describing the same behavior. That behavior was not predation. It was something else. At 17:09 hours, approximately, the animal began to submerge. This was as gradual and unhurried as the surfacing had been. The back settled toward the waterline without drama. The dorsal fin, last to emerge, was last to submerge, and in the final moments before it went under, I had a clear view of it from close to directly abeam. It was not a whale's fin. The shape was wrong, the angle was wrong, the proportion was wrong. It was triangular in the way that a shark's fin is triangular, but at a scale that removed it from any reference I had for sharks. The same way that a child's drawing of a mountain and an actual mountain are both triangular and share essentially nothing else. The fin submerged. The displaced water settled. The surface went flat. The cold receded over the following 45 minutes, as it had the previous night, gradually, as if withdrawing to a depth from which it could no longer reach us. The air temperature returned to normal. The deck thermometer climbed back toward its expected summer reading. Somewhere below the ship, something very large descended back into the dark. Ashby was the first to speak. He said, quite simply and with total conviction, "We have to lower the rig." Carrick said, from the bridge door, "We have to go north." I stood between them at the rail, and I thought about what Dr. Prosser had said that morning, that this was not a scientific question, but an ethical one. I had not fully understood her then. I understood her now. The question was not whether the animal was real. I had seen it with my own eyes from 40 yards in full daylight, and I was not a man who doubted his own perception when his perception was operating under clear, controlled conditions. The animal was real. The question was not whether we could document it. Ashby believed we could. He was probably correct. The camera rig, lowered to 200 feet on its cable, would have had a reasonable probability of capturing something at that depth, in that visibility. His hand camera had already produced photographs of the dorsal fin and back at the surface. We had a sounding record, a temperature record, a pressure event log, and 4 additional witnesses, including an officer, a scientist, and a contracted specialist. The question, which I did not fully articulate until much later, but which I felt in its entirety, standing at that rail, was this: What happens to something that has survived in secret in the Southern Ocean for the duration of time required to have been seen by a 16th century Portuguese crew and remained alive to be seen by my crew in 1932? What does that continuity require? And what does documenting it set in motion? I did not have a complete answer. I am not sure I have a complete answer now, sitting before this tribunal 31 years later. What I had then was a partial answer that was sufficient to produce a decision. I told Ashby we would not lower the rig. He looked at me. I want to describe his expression accurately. It was not anger, not immediately. It was the expression of a man who has just been told that the most important door he has ever stood in front of will not be opened. Devastation, contained in a face trying to remain professional. He asked me why. I told him I needed time to think. That was true. It was also insufficient, and I knew it even then. He nodded and walked away from the rail, and I did not see him again until supper. When I did see him at supper, he was quiet and composed, and he said nothing further about the rig that evening. But his composure was the composure of a man who had made a separate decision, and I should have understood that at the time, and I did not. I spent the evening in my chart room with the Portuguese chart. I sat with it for perhaps 3 hours, reading the margin annotations in both hands, and I thought about the people who had written them. The first hand, the navigator of the Santa Perpetua, who had written about a reef that breathes and added, "The cold comes before it rises." This was a person who had seen the animal, or its effects, and whose response was to add the observation to the chart so that the next navigator would know. Not to report it to the king, not to claim the discovery, to add a careful warning to the margin and seal the chart in a dispatch case. The second hand, who wrote that it turned toward us and we saw its length. This person had seen something that the first annotator may have only felt through the hull, seen it close enough to estimate its size relative to the ship, and whose response was, "Do not stop here, do not sound here. Do not lower anything into the water here." Those two responses together, across what may have been different voyages and different years, told me something about what the people who had been here before me had decided. They had decided that the right action was to leave, to warn the next person, and to keep the location specific, and known only in the margins of documents that would be read by people with a professional need to know. Not to suppress the information, not to publicize it, to keep it as a careful warning in a specialized record. That was the tradition, if you could call it that, in which I found myself standing, and I found, sitting at my chart table with the Portuguese chart open in front of me, that I agreed with it. Not enthusiastically, not without conflict, but I agreed with it. The question that remained was what to do about Ashby. I should have spoken to him directly that night. I did not. That is my failure in this account, and I own it completely. I was preoccupied with composing what I was going to write in my formal survey log, and with the question of how I was going to explain to the hydrographic office what we had found, and I told myself that Ashby's composure at supper meant his feelings had settled. I was wrong. At 0340 hours on the morning of January 18th, Carrick woke me. He said Ashby had been on deck since 0200 hours and had the camera rig's cable deployment arm rigged over the port side. I went up in my boots and uniform and found Ashby at the port rail in the dark, with the deployment arm extended and the cable feed unreeled and the housing for the camera in his hands. The camera was not in the water yet. He had been preparing to lower it. The night was clear and dark, with no moon. The sea was calm and warm, normal temperature. There was no cold event in progress. He had not waited for the animal. He was preparing to lower the camera into approximately 2,400 fathoms of dark Southern Ocean because he believed the animal might be below us and the camera might find it. I told him to stand down. He said, looking at the housing in his hands rather than at me, "You're going to bury this." I told him I hadn't decided what I was going to do. He said he had watched me in my chart room window from the deck for 2 hours that evening, and that I had the expression of a man who had already decided. I did not argue with the observation. I told him that I understood his position, that I did not think he was wrong about the scientific significance of what we had found, that I was not asking him to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. I was asking him to leave the rig out of the water until I had made a formal decision and communicated it to the team. He said, "If you bury it, they'll never stop looking. Someone else will come, and they won't have 5 centuries of charts telling them what not to do." That was the smartest thing anyone said on that voyage. I have thought about it for 31 years. He stood down. He retracted the cable, secured the housing, and brought the deployment arm back to its stowed position. He did all of this without assistance, competently and without drama. Then he went below. I do not think he slept. I stood at the rail for a while after he went below. The ocean around the ship was dark and normal, and gave no indication of what it contained. The air was warm and clear, and tasted of salt and open distance, the specific taste of very deep ocean that is different from coastal water, cleaner and more absolute. I gripped the rail and felt the ordinary temperature of the metal through my palms, and I thought about the 11-foot fin moving parallel to the hull in afternoon light, and I thought about the Portuguese navigator reloading his nib carefully in the margin of his chart, and I thought about what Ashby had said. Someone else will come, and they won't have 5 centuries of charts telling them what not to do. I stood there for a long time. In the morning I called the full team to my cabin. Carrick, Dr. Prosser, Ashby, and the 4 senior crew members who had been on deck during the sighting. I told them what I intended to do. I told them the survey log would record a hull pressure event consistent with thermal expansion and contraction along an uncharted geological formation. I told them the damage report would attribute the cork failure amidships to contact with an igneous shelf. I told them the survey data from the entire voyage would be surrendered to the Hydrographic Office under a routine classification filing, where it would enter archival storage and not be reviewed or published without a specific and unlikely request. I told them that the coordinate would not be updated in the Navigational Hazard Register, and that the existing historical chart annotations that had led me there would remain in the archive, but would not be flagged for special attention. Carrick said nothing. He had been expecting this. Dr. Prosser said she would like her field notebook included in the classified filing rather than surrendered separately, because she wanted it in a controlled environment. I agreed. She handed it to me at the end of the meeting, and I secured it in my document case. I do not know what became of it after it entered naval records. Ashby said he wanted to register a formal objection to the decision, for the record. I told him that the record of this meeting would be part of the classified filing, and that his objection would be included. He said that was not what he meant. I told him I understood. He did not say anything further. The 8 crew members sat with what they had been told and, one by one, acknowledged it. They were not asked to lie in any public forum. They were asked to say nothing, which is a different thing, and which men in naval service are well practiced at. I watched their faces, and I saw no rebellion, no contempt, no moral outrage. What I saw was relief. The night watchman who had felt the pressure event through his boots on the deck, the helmsman who had watched the fin from the bridge, the bosun who had found the cracked cork. None of them wanted to tell this story in an official venue, any more than I did. Some things are easier to carry in silence. We weighed anchor at 1100 hours on the 18th of January and steamed north. I stood on the bridge and watched the coordinate fall behind us as we made way. The sea around us was blue and warm and held its secrets the way deep water always does, without advertisement. We did not encounter anything unusual on the return passage. The temperature in the water returned to expected values within 3 hours of our departure and remained normal thereafter. There was no further hull pressure event, no cold event, nothing. Whatever awareness the animal had had of our presence apparently did not pursue us, or if it did not do so in any way we could measure. We arrived at Simonstown on the 4th of February, 1932. I filed the damage report attributing the hull stress to an uncharted igneous shelf 2 days later. I had the formal survey log completed and submitted to the hydrographic office within the week, and the entire set of voyage documents, including the survey data, Ashby's equipment log, the deck watch observations, and Dr. Prosser's field notebook, entered the classified filing system under a title that I cannot now recall with certainty, but that was something administrative and unprovocative. The Portuguese chart went back to the archive in its folder. The 5 sets of annotated historical charts I had compiled went back to their respective holdings. My cross-reference memorandum, the one I had written for Captain Morrow that proposed the voyage in the first place, entered the classified filing with the rest of the Perseverant materials. There was a brief inquiry from the hydrographic office about the fact that the geological survey had produced no geological data, and I explained that the seabed profile at the coordinate showed no feature of navigational significance, and the survey had been properly terminated as a result. They accepted this explanation. The matter was closed within the month. I returned to my regular duties. I was promoted to commander in 1934. I served through the war in increasingly administrative capacities, ending in a senior planning role that I will not describe in detail here because it is not relevant. I retired in 1961 with a satisfactory record and no significant disciplinary entries. I have given, in 31 years, approximately 112 survey voyage reports to various naval bodies and review committees, and every one of them, up to and including this deposition, is accurate. I need to address 2 things before I conclude. The first is Roland Ashby. He left naval contractual employment in the summer of 1932, and I lost track of him for several years. I learned through a professional acquaintance in 1937 that he had attempted, independently, to interest several scientific and publishing institutions in an account of an undescribed marine megafauna event in the Southern Ocean, without producing the photographs, which I believe he had surrendered in a moment of compliant professionalism that he may have regretted later, and without naming the voyage, the ship, or the coordinate. He was not taken seriously. The account he gave, stripped of documentation, stripped of witnesses who would corroborate publicly, stripped of the coordinate that would allow verification, was simply a large animal sighting in open ocean by a man who had no institutional affiliation and no evidence. It was not published. He made one further attempt in 1941 with a different framing, and I was told it also produced nothing. I do not know where he is now. I do not know if he is alive. I think about him with the specific weight that comes from knowing that a person's life was altered by a decision you made, and that the decision was defensible, and that this does not relieve you of anything. The second is the coordinate. I am not going to give the coordinate to this tribunal. I want to be precise about this, not because I have forgotten it. I have not. I have carried it in my memory for 31 years, with the same clarity I carry my own date of birth. I am not giving it because I have concluded, in 31 years of thinking about what Ashby said, standing at the port rail in the dark, that he was correct. If I give the coordinate, someone will go there. If someone goes there with better equipment than the Perseverant carried, and they will find something. And then the question of what they do with what they find will face someone else, someone who may not have 5 centuries of charts telling them what not to do. The Portuguese navigator who first wrote in the margin of that chart made the same decision with the same tool available to him, which was the ability to warn without disclosing. He wrote the cold comes before it rises. He wrote enough to tell the next man what to expect and to advise him to leave. He did not write the coordinate. He put the annotation in the margin of a chart that only a navigator with a specific professional need to read it would ever examine. He trusted the document to find the right reader, and in 1931, it did. I have done the same thing. This deposition is the margin annotation. It exists in the record. It will enter the tribunal's archive alongside the other Perseverant documents. It will be available, in principle, to anyone with access to those records, but it will be there as a warning, not an invitation. I am aware that this may frustrate the tribunal's stated purpose, which is the accurate historical record. I understand that. And the accurate historical record is precisely what I am providing, not the coordinate, but everything else. What we found, what it was, what we decided, what it cost. What it cost was this: a season of survey data that would have been the most significant oceanographic record in the 20th century, surrendered to a filing system where it will sit until either the institution decays or someone with the right clearance and the right questions eventually finds it. A man's professional credibility, Ashby's, spent on a truth he could not prove in any forum that would listen. A formal lie filed under my signature in a naval damage report that will stand as the official account of the Perseverant voyage unless this deposition is accepted as a correction. And the certainty, which I carry comfortably, that the decision was right, alongside the discomfort, which I also carry, that right decisions can still leave marks on people who did not make them. The Portuguese chart is Exhibit A before this tribunal. The cork repair log from the bosun's records, which was not classified because no one thought to classify it, is Exhibit B. My compiled cross-reference notes from the 5 annotated charts are Exhibit C. These 3 documents together constitute the physical record of everything I have testified to today. I am 61 years old. I have told the truth about what I saw. I want the tribunal to understand that when the cartographers of the 16th century drew sea monsters in the margins of their charts, they were not illustrating their ignorance of the world. They were illustrating their knowledge of it. They had been to those waters. They had felt the cold come before it rose. They had seen the back that was as long as their ship and more, and they had made the same decision I made in January of 1932, which was to put the warning in the margin and sail away from the coordinate and tell the next man, here is what is there, and here is why you should not stop. The maps were right. They were always right. The monster on the edge of the world is not a myth, and it is not a metaphor. It is an animal in the Southern Ocean that has been alive for longer than the cartographic tradition itself, and it has never, in 5 centuries of documented encounter, done anything to any of those ships except surface alongside them and go back down. The oldest and most consistent witness testimony we have says it does not want us dead. It wants us to leave. I have left. I recommend the same.